Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are opening a file on a figure who is, frankly, a walking paradox.
He really is.
If you look at the history books, he's described as this giant, the scholar of the nation, the interpreter of the Quran. You'd picture a gray-bearded sage who spent decades by the prophet's side. But here is the kicker. When the prophet Muhammad passed away, this giant was barely a teenager, maybe 13 years old.
It's one of the most fascinating case studies in all of Islamic history. We're talking about Abdullah ibn Abbas.
Yeah.
And you're right, the timeline, it doesn't seem to make sense at first glance.
That's the thing. We have a stack of sources here. Biographies, hadith collections, modern critical analyses, and the numbers are just staggering. He is credited with narrating about 1,660 hadiths.
An incredible number.
He's the go-to guy for Quranic interpretation. How does a 13-year-old boy become the foundational legal authority for an entire civilization?
That is the central tension we need to unpack. We aren't just reciting a biography today. We need to investigate the how. How did he bridge that gap? We need to look at the mechanics, his memory, the controversies around his unique rulings.
Oh, and there were controversies.
For sure, because he definitely went against the grain. And then how modern scholars verify this massive output from someone so young.
Okay, so let's start with the sheer volume. 1,660 narrations. Physically, how is that possible? I mean, if he was just a kid in the back of the room, surely he wasn't present for all those events.
He wasn't, and that's a crucial distinction. There are two layers to this answer: the spiritual and the technical. On the spiritual side, the sources place immense weight on a specific dua, a prayer the prophet made for him.
This is the blessing of memory I've read about.
Yes. The narration goes that the prophet held him and said, "O Allah, teach him wisdom and the interpretation of the book." For the traditionalists, this is the key.
So divine intervention.
It's seen that way, yes. That it allowed a young mind to act like a kind of super sponge, retaining these complex legal details that even adults might miss.
Okay, that explains the capacity, but it doesn't explain the logistics. If he wasn't in the room for an event that happened 10 years before he was born, how was he narrating it?
Right, and this brings us to a technical term that comes up constantly in the analysis. It's called mursal al-sahabi.
Which basically means a missing link, right?
Sort of. Think of it this way. Imagine a company releases a press statement. The spokesperson reads it. You trust the spokesperson, so you report the company said X.
You didn't speak to the CEO directly.
Exactly. But the source is part of the trusted inner circle. Mursal al-Sahabi is when a companion, in this case Ibn Abbas, reports the prophet said, but he actually heard it from a senior companion like Umar or Ali.
So he's essentially doing investigative journalism.
Yeah.
He's interviewing the older generation and compiling their knowledge.
Precisely. Scholars estimate he might have heard only maybe 20 to 50 hadiths directly from the prophet's lips. The other 1,600, that was the result of pure, unadulterated hustle after the prophet died.
The hustle stories are my favorite part of this research. It wasn't just sitting in a classroom. There's this vivid image of him, camping out on people's doorsteps.
It is vivid, isn't it? He describes going to the house of a senior Ansari companion during the midday heat, the siesta time. And instead of knocking and waking them up, which would be rude, he would just spread his cloak on the doorstep and wait.
Wow.
The wind would blow dust over him until he looked practically unrecognizable.
Just waiting for them to wake up so he could ask for a single quote?
Right. And when the companion would finally come out, shocked to find the prophet's cousin sleeping in the dirt, Ibn Abbas would say, I wanted to come to you, for knowledge is to be sought, it does not come to you.
That is profound. It flips the script on how we think about authority. He wasn't just born with the knowledge, he had to chase it down.
And that's what validates the volume of his work. The community accepted these narrations because the companions were considered oodle truthful. So even if he didn't name his source every single time, the assumption was he got it from a reliable senior figure. He was building this network of trust.
But he wasn't just a tape recorder, was he? Reading through his legal opinions, he strikes me as a bit of a maverick. He didn't just repeat what he heard.
No, not at all.
He interpreted it, and sometimes those interpretations landed him in hot water.
Maverick is the perfect word. Ibn Abbas really represents the transition from revelation to, independent legal reasoning. And because he was willing to use his own reasoning, he sometimes stood completely alone against the consensus.
Let's dive into the most explosive one, muta, or temporary marriage. This is still a massive point of contention between Sunni and Shia Muslims today.
It is. So muta refers to a marriage contract with a fixed end date.
Yeah.
And Ibn Abbas held the view that this was permissible, specifically citing chapter 4, verse 24 of the Quran.
But looking at the context, he wasn't just saying have fun, right? He had a specific rationale.
Correct. He viewed it as a kind of mercy allowed for times of extreme necessity, specifically war or travel, where men were away from their spouses for months or years. He saw it as a pressure valve, really, to prevent adultery.
But this put him on a collision course with some heavy hitters.
The heaviest.
Yeah.
The sources detail a clash with Ali ibn Abi Talib, his own cousin, and the fourth caliph. Ali explicitly corrected him, stating that the Prophet forbade muta at the Battle of Khaybar.
So here's where the history gets tricky. Did Ibn Abbas back down?
Well, that depends entirely on who you ask. Sunni sources generally argue that Ibn Abbas retracted this view later in life.
Right.
They say once the evidence of the prohibition was made clear to him, he said, okay, I was wrong. They view it as intellectual humility. He didn't know the abrogating text, and then he learned it.
And the Shia perspective.
Shia sources maintain that he held on to this view until the end. They argue that the ban was instated by Caliph Umar for social reasons, not by the Prophet. So they use Ibn Abbas's initial stance as proof that the practice was originally valid.
So you have one historical figure being pulled in two directions to support two totally different legal frameworks.
Exactly.
It really shows that even in the first generation, the law wasn't a monolith. There was debate.
Huge debate.
Speaking of debate, let's talk economics. He had a very unique take on riba, or usury.
This one is fascinating because it really shows his literalist streak. Initially, Ibn Abbas believed riba only applied to nasiya interest charged on a delayed payment.
So, I lend you 100 today, you pay me 110 next month. The standard definition.
Right. But he didn't think it applied to spot exchanges, riba al-fadl. For example, trading high-quality gold for a larger amount of low-quality gold. The majority said no, gold for gold must be equal. Ibn Abbas said if it's hand-to-hand, it's fine.
That seems like a massive loophole. You could easily manipulate the market that way.
It had huge economic implications. But again, look at his process. He held this view until he was confronted with a specific hadith from the Prophet regarding the 6 commodities.
Okay.
And that hadith explicitly forbids inequality in spot exchanges. Once he was presented with that data, reports suggest he retracted.
So he followed the text. If the text wasn't there, he used reason. If the text appeared, he dropped his reason.
Exactly. But there is one area where he stuck to his guns against the entire state apparatus, the math problem. The inheritance dispute known as all.
I looked at the math on this, and honestly, I see his point.
It's a classic logic problem, isn't it?
Yeah.
In Islamic inheritance, specific fractions are assigned to heirs: a half, a quarter, an eighth. But sometimes when you have a lot of heirs, say a husband, 2 sisters, and a mother, the fractions add up to more than one whole.
Right. It's like having a pie. You give half to the husband, 2/3 to the sisters, and suddenly you need 1.2 pies. You physically run out of pie.
Exactly. So Caliph Umar came up with a pragmatic solution called all. He basically shrank everyone's slice proportionally. If the total is 1.25, you shrink everyone's share so it fits back into 1.0.
Seems fair. Everyone gets something. So why did Ibn Abbas hate it?
Because he refused to believe God would reveal a math error. He argued, do you think the one who knows the count of the sands of the desert made a mistake in fractions? He implied the error was in our application.
So what was his solution then?
He favored a method where certain heirs, those with stronger ties, took their full share first and the others just lost out. If the pie runs out, the last person gets nothing.
Wow, that is harsh.
It is harsh, but to him, it was textually consistent. You can't just rewrite the fractions to make the math work. He eventually had to accept the state's practice because Umar established it as law, but he never ever intellectually agreed with it. It just shows a mind that was fiercely attached to the literal word of the Quran.
That connection to the Quran brings us to the spiritual side. We've talked law, we'll talk theology. There's this massive debate about the ultimate vision. Did the Prophet actually see God?
The Ruya. This is high-stakes theology. Did the Prophet see Allah with his physical eyes during the Miraj, the night journey? Ibn Abbas is the main proponent of, yes, he did.
But this puts him in the ring against Aisha, the Prophet's wife, and she didn't mince words about this.
No, she did not. She famously said, whoever claims Muhammad saw his Lord has lied. And she grounded her argument in the Quranic verse, vision perceives him not.
So you have the scholar of the nation saying yes, and the mother of the believer saying no. That is a serious conflict.
It is, and scholars reconcile it by looking at the nuance in Ibn Abbas's language. He often specified seeing with the heart, or spiritual vision, ruya al-qalb, whereas Aisha was denying physical, ocular sight.
So they might have been talking about two different things.
Possibly. But the fact that they publicly disagreed on something so fundamental tells you a lot about the intellectual climate. It wasn't an echo chamber.
Speaking of things that aren't echo chambers, we have to talk about the weird stuff. The research notes mention Israeliyat.
I knew we would get here.
I mean, I'm reading narrations attributed to him about the earth being on the back of a giant fish, which is on water, which is on a green rock. It feels like ancient sci-fi. What is going on here?
This is where we have to understand the hunger for story in the early community. The Quran is often very concise. It tells the moral of a story, but leaves out the details. Ibn Abbas was just so intellectually curious. He interacted with Jewish converts to Islam, like Ka'b al-Ahbar.
So he went to them to get the director's cut of the biblical stories.
Exactly. He would ask about the backstory of prophets, the creation of the world, details found in the Torah or the Talmud, but not the Quran. These are called Israeliyat.
But did he believe the earth was literally on a fish?
That is the debate. Critics argue these stories colored his commentary, but most scholars say he was using them for context or just relaying them as interesting information without validating them as Islamic truth. The problem arose later, when narrators dropped the disclaimer and just said, Ibn Abbas said the earth is on a fish. It's a game of telephone that turned folklore into fact.
It's a good reminder to always check the source. Now, moving from folklore to hard politics. We can't talk about Ibn Abbas without talking about his last name, Abbas. He is the ancestor of the Abbasid caliphs who took over the Muslim world in 750 CE.
And that casts a massive shadow over his legacy.
How much did that family connection warp the history books? Because if I'm an Abbasid king, I definitely want my great-grandfather to look like the most important person in the room.
Precisely. After the Abbasid revolution, it became politically advantageous to circulate hadiths that praised the lineage of al-Abbas. So scholars have to be very careful to sift through narrations that heavily emphasize the virtues of the family.
So there's a layer of propaganda.
There's definitely a layer of political propaganda where factions, Umayyads versus Abbasids, tried to claim him. The core of his scholarship is authentically his, but you have to be aware of the spin.
But there is one political event where he isn't just a figurehead. He's a witness to something incredibly painful, the calamity of Thursday.
Razia Yam al-Khamis. This is one of the most heavy emotional moments in the sources.
Set the scene for us. This is the prophet's deathbed, right?
Yes. It's the Thursday before the prophet passes away. The room is crowded with companions. The prophet is in severe pain. And he asks for writing materials, a pen and paper, to write a statement so the community will not go astray after him.
And this is where the room just explodes.
It turns into chaos. Caliph Umar, who was present, argued that the prophet was delirious from pain and that they shouldn't burden him. He famously said, "The book of Allah is sufficient for us." Others in the room shouted that they should get the pen. They just started arguing in the presence of the dying prophet.
That image is heartbreaking.
It is. The prophet eventually told them to leave, but Ibn Abbas, his narration of this is haunting. He describes it as a calamity. He says tears were flowing down his cheeks like strings of pearls because that writing never happened.
And again, the sectarian lens changes how we see this.
Completely. Sunni scholars view Umar's intervention as protective. He was trying to save the prophet from the strain. Shia scholars view it as the suppression of a will that would have designated Ali as successor. And Ibn Abbas stands in the middle, conveying the sheer tragedy of the confusion. He doesn't offer a political solution in the narration, he just documents the grief.
It's a heavy burden to carry. And speaking of carrying burdens, we have to talk about the man who carried Ibn Abbas's legacy forward. His student, Ikrimah.
The student problem. This is a detective story in itself. Ikrimah was Ibn Abbas's freed slave and his primary student. But Ikrimah had a massive red flag. He was accused of being a Kharijite.
And we need to explain that term. Being a Kharijite wasn't just having a different opinion. These were extremists, right?
They were revolutionaries. They believed that if a leader sinned, they were no longer Muslim and should be killed.
Yeah.
They assassinated Caliph Ali. They were, the terrorists of their day.
So you have the main student of the scholar of the nation accused of being a terrorist sympathizer.
Yes. And this caused a huge rift in how his knowledge was received. Imam Malik, the founder of the Maliki school, famously rejected narrations from Ikrimah. he wouldn't touch them.
But if you throw out Ikrimah, you lose a huge chunk of Ibn Abbas's work.
Exactly. And that's why Imam Bukhari, the compiler of the most authentic Sunni hadith collection, accepted him.
Okay, why?
Bukhari looked at the data. Was Ikrimah accurate in his reporting? Yes. Did his political views change the text? No. So Bukhari accepted the narrator despite the ideology.
That is a fascinating separation of church and state, so to speak, separating the man from the data.
It gets even messier. There is a report where Ibn Abbas himself might have tied Ikrimah up and called him a liar.
Wait, his own teacher tied him up?
Allegedly. Ibn Abbas said, "This man lies about me." But scholars reconcile this by suggesting Ikrimah might have been careless early on or that Ibn Abbas was disciplining him, yet he remained the main vessel. It's a reminder that these chains of transmission are human. They are messy, complex, and full of friction.
Let's pivot to something a bit more grounded. We've covered high politics and theology. What about his views on society? Specifically, the people who were often marginalized women and slaves.
His views were surprisingly nuanced for the 7th century. Take the Quranic verse that says, "Men have a degree over women."
Which is usually interpreted as authority, I'm the boss.
Right. But Ibn Abbas interpreted that degree as a degree of responsibility, not privilege. He argued that because men have this degree, they should be the ones to waive their rights and be more lenient. He famously said, "I love to beautify myself for my wife, just as I love for her to beautify herself for me."
That's a very reciprocal view of marriage.
It is. He also preserved the narration where a girl came to the prophet saying her father forced her into a marriage. The prophet gave her the choice to annul it. That single narration, preserved by Ibn Abbas, is a cornerstone of women's consent in Islamic law.
And regarding slavery, you mentioned Ikrimah was a freed slave.
Ibn Abbas was a man of his time. He owned slaves. But he was deeply invested in manumission freeing them, viewed it as a high form of charity. But more importantly, look at who he invested in. He entrusted his entire intellectual legacy to Ikrimah, a former slave of Berber origin.
He didn't choose a fancy Quraishi noble.
No. He chose the person who had the aptitude. It was an intellectual meritocracy.
So let's bring this all together. We started with a 13-year-old boy. We ended with the scholar of the nation. What is the big picture takeaway here?
The big picture is that Ibn Abbas is the bridge. He bridges the era of revelation, when the prophet was alive and God was speaking to, the era of interpretation. He showed the community that once the revelation stops, the work of the mind begins.
And that work isn't always neat and tidy.
Never. His legacy teaches us that unity in Islam didn't mean uniformity. The earliest community had heated debates about math, marriage, theology, and politics. They disagreed on the how, but they were united in the why. Ibn Abbas represents the courage to ask questions, even uncomfortable ones, and the humility to bow to evidence when it appears.
That is a powerful takeaway. But before we go, I want to leave our listeners with one of those cosmological deep cuts we touched on earlier, because frankly, it blew my mind.
I have a feeling I know which one. The 7 Earths.
The 7 Earths. There is a narration attributed to Ibn Abbas where he explains the verse about Allah creating 7 heavens and of the earth the like of them. And he reportedly said, get this, that on each of those earths there is a prophet like your prophet, an Adam like your Adam, a Noah like your Noah, a Jesus like your Jesus.
It's a stunning concept.
It sounds like the multiverse in the 7th century. I know scholars debate its authenticity, but just the fact that a scholar back then was willing to conceptualize multiple worlds with their own salvation histories.
It really challenges our perception of how closed or open early Islamic thought was.
Right.
It suggests a universe far more vast and mysterious than we often give them credit for imagining.
It certainly gives you something to think about when you look up at the stars tonight. That's a wrap for this deep dive into the life of Abdullah ibn Abbas. Thanks for listening, and stay curious.